Good morning. After such word of introduction by Lena, it looks like no effort that I could take could make me be up to these reinvented or presented level. Indeed, I've known Lena and Yura for quite a while, since those old-time Soviet times. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we, without ever consulting each other, each of us tried in each our way to carry out the initiatives that, in our view, we thought were very necessary to adapt to the new reality, to post-Soviet space, for some countries within post-Soviet space, whereas we fully understood that intellectually we were not prepared to the challenges that post-totalitarian transformation faces. Well, it is very difficult to acknowledge, and it's very difficult to be critical towards oneself, because too much in those years they were enthusiastic people who were absolutely convinced that the problems has been addressed. I mean, those enthusiasts on either side, in the post-Soviet space as well as in the West, and further on, what would follow, we should continue what we did before, following the route, following the well-paved road towards progress. It seems like all of us, we needed to get some existential experience, the sense that we were mistaken then, we were misled, but there's no guarantee that this experience may help us here. Of course, I belong to a generation that probably, as we feel that there is little left, and others may feel that they were pushed out into retirement where they no longer take part in active life, there is a need for compensation in sharing one's experience with others, especially with the younger generation, and share with you the experience that we have accumulated. I fully understand psychologically the need for this situation, but it seems that I do not belong to these kind of people, and when a while ago I was invited to talk before you, to be honest, I thought hard before accepting this offer. You know, in my day, too much talk. There's too much empty-worded talk that Kierkegaard already sensed in mid-19th century. Can you imagine? It was back then. What sort of epoch it was, very different from the time we live in. And then by Heidegger, who also spoke about Gerede, talkativeness, gaggle, just empty talk. For a number of circumstances, especially in modern world, because of Facebook, through creating something that was quite inconceivable in those days, there's space, these prophecies were probably never heard in those days, as often is the case. And nowadays they adopt such proportions and such forms that it is not quite clear what you do about this situation. Before we think about what I can offer to you today, I'm reluctant to have it perceived like a lecture or me lecturing to you. No, it is an invitation to hold a conversation. Instead, I chose the figure of Hannah Arendt, who at my initiative in my university in Vilnius, the conference that was attended by the specialists and experts from US, UK, the Netherlands, and Germany, at last we hosted a conference dedicated to the heritage of Hannah Arendt. So this conference was inevitable. Sometimes it would take a format, again, of verbosity, of prolixity. It's impossible to avoid it. But I suppose that in some way we succeeded in starting a serious conversation about the condition our reasoning is in, which much more often is perceived like something that goes without saying, something that is natural, especially now that recently, now that we have very good wording, powerful wording, which in Russian is known as critical thinking, we now use these weapons towards whatever we may feel like, but to a lesser degree, we tend to use it against ourselves. We perceive ourselves as people who have the authority to do this, and we tend to forget what we are like in reality. Hannah Arendt, for good reason, it was no accident that I chose Hannah Arendt today for the conversation with you. And I believe there's no need today to speak about what Hannah Arendt was, who she was. Let me give her brief biography. She had excellent education in brilliant universities in Germany, and multiplied by what was ahead of her, highly professional, academic, high-flown life. She's researched St. Augustine in medieval philosophy, and she was taught by top philosophers, but back in mid-last century, she designated the new outlook. And I suppose she did it very briefly. She designated the problem that we really need to think hard about. In English, because she wrote in German and in English, since English is now a more widespread language, it is known as thought and reality have parted company. In other words, thinking and reality are sensing there's a growing gap between them. And there's a great challenge here, because each of us perceive oneself in line with a traditional understanding within the European tradition, perceiving oneself as a creature where the special feature is exactly ability to reason, ability to think. And these thinkings, which are already well set in our minds and are the main motive of the European tradition, where humans are perceived as Homo sapiens, res cogitas, by Descartes. This is a way to identify what is special about human being in their existence. Thus, we are guided by the assumption that we are creatures that are unlike other creatures because we have reasoning, we have thinking. But do let us think to which extent this attribute of thinking belongs to us genetically, very much like as if we didn't have, of course, if we don't have at birth some birth defects. There are children born mute, deaf and blind. To which extent reasoning belongs to each of us individually, very much like the ability, say, to see or ability to hear, hearing and seeing. Again, in absence of birth defect, this is probably an ability that we have, enjoy. We hear sounds from very first moments of our life. We begin to perceive the world, and this is something that we've been endowed with through our genetics and long-time evolution of a creature known as human being. So to which extent this attribute of reasoning, of thinking, is something that we really own, that we have, to which extent it is there. And Hannah Arendt says that thinking and reality, when they part company, she stated that back in mid-last century. And she continues to say that reality is becoming non-transparent for the light of thinking. And she continues also that all the instruments of our thinking, that is notions, categories, all the tools we use, which we have to when we are in this world, when we need to address this world in order to exist there. But they seem to work less and less. That was one of the motives why I assumed and thought that it would be necessary to once again get back to reconsider the heritage of Hannah Arendt. Because way too often, when we speak about traditions and the importance of heritage, we at that continue to just pay lip service. And we never seem to learn by somebody else's mistakes. We do not learn these lessons, whereas Hannah Arendt faced this as she had a brilliant prospects of academic career opening before her. She knew ancient Greek, she knew this poetry by heart. She had all the qualities which potentially we don't even dream of having. She grew in an atmosphere that was permeated with European and German culture. And she sensed that it turns out that all this that was accumulated through centuries of human culture did not work automatically. It's great when you have it, that you have it, but you cannot assume that this is something that exists automatically and would automatically program those that stay within its space. You do know that Hannah Arendt had to flee, and it was by miracle that she was saved. She was arrested because of a Jewish background in Nazism during Nazi regime. It is curious that by just miracle, it is very curious, she actually shares that with us in her interview as she talked to an officer who decided her fate, who was supposed to actually send her to the concentration camp. She saw in him the light of, a gleam of human face. And in their brief communication, there was a ray of spiritual interaction between them. And he influenced her, and he let her slip away. And Hannah Arendt was absolutely shattered existentially as a person who found herself on the brink of this disaster. She was much more shattered with another problem. She saw a situation where she could not contemplate how this could have happened. What I mean is, fascist regime with all things that were happening there in a culture that is far from being ignorant, a culture with richest, most powerful traditions of philosophy, art, literature, poetry, music. This is a richest culture. How could a nation like Germans, well, as if they were trained in education system, and it was made that they would be adopting those values from one generation to another. How could they fall so lowly? This was a tragedy of the nation, and one of the impulses that affected Hannah Arendt. And she, as you know, wrote a treatise, a well-known treatise on totalitarianism. She tried to contemplate Eichmann's court hearing after the end of the war. She was amazed that Eichmann's figure showed absence of thinking. The fact of absent thinking in a human who is not, primitive, who arrived from the middle of nowhere. Well, at that, he doesn't reason, he doesn't think. Going back to where I started, We perceive ourselves as thinking creatures. And men placed into this tradition, being an heir of this tradition in all this culture, it doesn't seem to influence this fact of absent thinking, non-existent thinking. And Hannah Arendt later wrote a very short book, which is very curious and very nice. Lessons that we prefer to forget. In English, it is known as Between Past and Future. In German, it is known by its German name. It's very curious that there are 2 chapters in the book. One of them is known Crisis in Education. The other is known as Crisis in Culture. So, the book was published in German and in English. And the very semantics of definitions of the words that we use, the words that are at our disposal, has many potentials which, to such degree, predetermine what we understand by using some term or another, that in the long run, it means that its context is predetermined. When she writes an article in English, The Crisis in Education, I expected, I first read it in English, that would be a paper, at least although this displacement of meaning between the words Bildung in German and education in English. Bildung is Bildobraz in English, образование, like image making. In German, it would sound like Bildung, although that alone is already some changed meaning, because образование, education, is not only giving formal knowledge, it is shaping the image. So when she seeks to the man who doesn't have all the genetic properties that even primitive organisms have to a full degree, for those organisms and for other creatures, there is no such thing as kindergartens, schools, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, let alone doctoral programs. They have all it takes for further existence in this world and in this. So man found himself from nature much more weakened creature, the one that didn't have all these properties. That is why for such a lengthy process of involving him in education, and it is important to have many years of schooling, but what it should be like, what is it made of? So, as we speak about the crisis in education, Hannah Arendt actually never finished this thought about Bildung. I was surprised to see that in German it doesn't even read as Bildung. It is Erziehung, which is, again, in English all the same, like teaching manners, like, we know, like in post-Soviet time, the word воспитание was discredited because they mostly meant communist upbringing, character building. But you know, words are not to blame for the meaning we attribute to them. Somebody distorted the original meaning. So in the German text, this article is known as The Crisis of Upbringing, and she's right. It's not only about equipping a person with some knowledge. The thing is that in some way, every time, each epoch faces a problem of education as shaping and upbringing and character building. And it never happens even in countries where it seems to have a powerful potential for many centuries, even millennia, beginning with ancient Greece. But this potential may stay idle. For that matter, I think that Professor Scherer may confirm, was it in 62 or 63, or was it in 63 or 64 that Georg Picht, a well-known professor of philosophy, organized a discussion in German press known as the German education disaster in German education. Let's think of it. What's the meaning of this? Which was designated by Georg Picht in a country that had very powerful traditions of education. They date back to Humboldt and traditions that this way or other do have some potential. And he was saying it took 2 years to hold this hot discussion. German disaster, catastrophe in education. The thing is that this tragedy of the German nation and German culture happened just exactly because probably human creatures are unable to perceive reality as such in the way it exists. And the problems in our thinking, problems of our knowledge, at some time or other become a format that shapes our ideas about the world as we impose these ideas to the world per se. We would like to see it this way. This is when we get into the sphere of wishful thinking, and it's no word in German because this is the way we would like to believe it is. And it's understandable as man lives in this world, as he comes to this world and realizing he had nothing to do with his appearing in this world and discovers oneself in this world as he needs some guidelines and has to seek for ways to encourage oneself, ways to designate and contemplate the need to exist in this world. And more often than not, the illusions are probably inevitable for each and every one of us. And they are around us in such a way that we get into the trap of this illusionary idea that has to do with the condition of our thinking. We impose it to the reality and expect the reality to be transformed in line with our expectations. Far from that. Traditional wordings are such, they're of the equality of the sameness between thinking and existence. It's probably a challenge to the existence which can never be enough to be able in exhaustive manner to contemplate the reality. And since early 20th century,
even before the regime came to power, the disasters of the First and the Second World Wars and the rise of totalitarianism and the anxiety was on the rise. The concern for the humans in those framework of thought, in those configurations which have become more or less lifelike. And one of the great German philosophers and mathematicians, Edmund Husserl, stated a principle which is not always adequately deciphered or even perceived in language, which is "zu den Sachen Recht," which is translated into Russian as into English as "to the things proper." However, there was a certain understanding of this term insofar as there was a necessity to overcome the theoretical structure of mind, the contemplation, which is based on abstract basis of some subject, an abstract personality who, by definition, is endowed with certain mindset, and then to extrapolate this. And this is the principle that Husserl talked about, is more like the view of a child. In the famous fairy tale by Hans Andersen about the emperor who lost his clothes. And he said that the emperor is without the cloth. The child says what he sees. So it is an attempt to see the things which are, without those, without these optics, without my spectacles, which allow me to see your faces. In a particular way, because without these spectacles, I can't do it for whatever national deficiencies that I may have. So these eyeglasses allow me to do something. So in some cases, theory is like these spectacles, which formally help, but at the same time may distort and convert the reality in combination with these optics. So Husserl speaks about transformation of the mind in one of the letters that he writes to a neo-Kantian Rickert in 1910. Husserl writes, "I am terrified by the quality of the publications in the philosophical journals which I read." And he's, mind you, talking about the great German philosophical tradition, 1910. He is terrified by the quality of what he reads. And it is about philosophy. So the question really is everything that is defined in a particular way is what it is defined to be? Ortega y Gasset, who, in the opinion of Albert Camus, is one of the greatest thinkers after Nietzsche, says that the human activities must always be realized according to its authenticity. In other words, there are different qualities of the same article, which is called one and the same. If I play chess, then what I do is called chess. Can I say that I am a chessman because I play chess, but while knowing that there are others who play chess? And indeed, this is a problem of those and who are very numerous. And Ortega y Gasset writes, "Not all philosophers are philosophers. They teach philosophy, surely for prestige or for earnings, to gain the daily bread. But if they are not philosophers, then why do they teach philosophy? And what kind of philosophy do they teach if they're not philosophers?" But there's a host of educational institutions, organizations, colleges and schools in my region and elsewhere where there's a high demand. But how obscure and murky this process of education becomes, where there is no education, and when only the name has stayed. And how is this challenge that Hannah Arendt spoke about is to be coped with for realizing what is happening in our times? And I'm really still trying to embark on my topic. And indeed, my topic here is knowing and thinking. Of course, the differentiation between knowing and thinking is not was not proposed by Hannah Arendt for the first time. Heraclitus spoke about it. He said that much knowledge does not teach thinking. And of course, in ancient Greece, we did not have as many schools as now. But it was already known that much knowledge does not lead one to think, does not teach thinking. Many centuries later, Kant, in the Critique of the Pure Reason, writes that any even a stupid and blunt man mindset, and that is a sarcastic formulation. Every blunt or limited mind may go up to knowledge. It's a somewhat grim view. Stupid or a blunt man becoming knowledgeable. At the same time, Kant says that such a person does not have something in sufficient manner, something that he calls Urteilskraft. Here again, we are encountering the problem of transition. Urteil in German has multiple meanings. Kafka has this word, Urteil. It's also the divine sentence. It's the judgment. So Kant, having named this problem in the Critique of Pure Reason, while a representative of the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, still could not overcome some stereotypes of those from those times when Socrates and Plato, after Socrates' tragic death, Plato tried to make some conclusions to be removed into some true world, the true world of ideas. So, however, Kant, when talking about Urteilskraft, the problem of judgment, still, when he speaks about the problem of knowledge, he ends this with his the words in the introduction. Kant says that there are two shafts of human cognizance, which apparently stem from one and the same unknown source: sensitivity and reason. So Kant says that in the end, our knowledge is the interplay of two elements, which apparently are parts of some deep-lying and undefinable source. And at this bifurcation of sensitivity and reason, Kant emphasizes the Critique of Pure Reason, where the philosopher turns to the analysis of the problem of our knowledge and the procedures of our cognizance. This happens under the perception and the rationality which seeks to stand clear of the sensitive world. However, we do live in this world. We survive this world. We are, in a way, reacting to this world. This is our original perception. It's not an abstract way. It's a perception of this world which may not be particularly pleasant, as long as we are being pushed out into this world as infants, as newborns. But we would like, of course, to be governing this world. It's because we want to live in this world, and of course we're not given genetically. We do not live under the same regime as other living creatures. And only in the last critique, and Hannah Arendt also speaks about it, which is the critic of critique of Urteilskraft, which is translated into Russian and English not quite adequately, because Kraft is not a judgment, because a judgment indeed is a bit a weak synonym for Kraft, which is of course power and energy, and judgment is a bit better in. But Urteil in German stems from two parts, Ur and Tal, which means that this is a logical statement. When I say that rose is a flower, I bring together subject and the predicate. And I bring those together. But it is not about a logical formula. And Kant, in his critique, brings us back to the acts of thinking, which may be different. And in this sense, we have something that corresponds to this reality. For instance, I know what is a house, what is a little dog, and we presume that this is a cat or a dog, and then we call it with the terms. So I am giving some names, and because I know these, I take them into some specific notions. And this house can either be a palace or a hut. It is all a house. So that means that I have a certain specific knowledge. But Kant also says that there are some judgments whereby Kant turns to arts, to the art. Interestingly, Hannah Arendt either passes it mute, and Hannah Arendt was very conscious of it. And she speaks that Kant's last works may be perceived as something dedicated to the art. But Hannah Arendt says that Kant's last part of the critique is also on the political theory. And while Hannah Arendt was a very well-educated philosopher, she departs. She refuses to be called a philosopher. It is possibly because is that this term has been discredited too much. She could well consider herself to be a philosopher. So, what is and how is it that Hannah Arendt states that what is generally viewed in the critical literature on Kant as something dedicated to the arts and to the works of art suddenly springs up as a political theory? And interestingly, how creatively and how beautifully she finds something that has not been seen before. One of the editors of the last translation of this critique of judgment, Mary Robbins, if I'm not mistaken, says that Kant writes this last critique as if he had not read the first. That's an interesting statement, and it is truly the case. Kant, trying to finish, to complete his critiques, talks about the principles which have been called earlier. He sees that his critiques do not well apply to the works of art. He cannot, he says, make myself like something only because I have a notion that it has to be beautiful and it has to be something that I like. I am in a state when something startles me, and I'm under this startling impression, and then nothing is of interest to me. They say in Russian, the love is evil, one may fall in love with a goat. And they often say, what did she find in him, or what did he find in her? And it is about the subjective feeling, something that is of liking. Dostoevsky used to speak about the power of beauty. And Kant says that for this, that there is this perception, and what I generally disseminate with the hope that that this concrete will be obeying to the general. This bottomlessness, this lack of basis, whereas I am under this startling impression. And the question really is, how can I translate this to others? The same happens as it's about things which are quite unclear to me as to why they're happening. And then there is a question that every time when I arrived at such a conclusion, and I have to try and explain why does this happen. Every time, and Hannah Arendt has a beautiful collection of essays, Responsibility of Judgment. And when I like something, when I try to substantiate something, then there is this great perception it's a problem of sociality, of social interaction. And I really should never try to impose my tastes on others. But the question really is, what are we to do when every time we have to make an opinion, to express an opinion, to make a judgment with respect to a specific case? And so we have to be extremely cautious to understand that there are some formulas of knowledge which are given to us and that we have to impose upon the reality. What is happening in the world today provides a more than sufficient basis to understand that apparently there's been abuse of these abstract notions. an abstract or a category of abstract thinking. I listen to the BBC when I have my breakfast in the morning, and they said on the BBC that the American negotiations with Taliban, which have been unfolding for about a year, even behind the back of a pro-American Afghan government. So these negotiations are dead. They have been cancelled. But the problem is that for already 18 years, the United States are trying to do something in Afghanistan, to act in Afghanistan. And there is no doubt that the motives of these actions are extrajudicial. Of course, this is a reality which needs transformation. But if this transformation is done through imposition of some schemes or configurations which are very foreign to the situation, then it is no wonder that after 18 years of huge human efforts, loss, and of course financial losses, is that we have seen as many casualties in Afghanistan as this year, and Taliban has never been as strong in the past 25 years as last year. So what was the result of these 18 years of campaign in Afghanistan? And I remember what was the general liking and the wow effect of the death of Muammar Gaddafi. But what is happening in Libya today is an horror without an end. This is something that we're seeing in Syria, this is something that we're seeing in Libya, and this is something that we see how a contemporary world, which is in motion, which has gone through and seen the emergence of some new players, how. And yesterday, I listened to the BBC, and they reacted to the great festivities on the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. If anybody had spoken in the end of the 19th century about the role of China in today's world, I think nobody would have believed what is happening. The shocks in the financial markets influenced the entire world. However, for a long time, the West was under the illusion that economies can only be built upon certain principles, and that we cannot see it happening in other cultures. But we see how it actually did happen, how economies were built upon other principles of, say, political economy. So the question really is, what is happening with our mindset when we perceive something post factum? And what we do is comment at best. But the number of these comments is very, very high. Last year, I read in Frankfurter Allgemeine about a congress of the Association of Political Sciences in Europe. I think that the Congress took place in Hamburg in August of last year, and apparently it's some sort of an elite of political thinking in Europe today. The participants in this Congress, 4,000 people, all of Europe was represented. The program had, I think, about 250 pages. 250 pages. The comments by Frankfurter Allgemeine with respect to this Congress were more than sarcastic. The Frankfurter Allgemeine had no idea what were they talking about. So this isolation of the mind, this total so-called thinking what is apparently happening in these framework. To what extent, as Hannah Arendt said, can we rely upon thinking, which has become indeed too removed from the reality, which posits to be very self-confident and ambitious when the reality has long left and is out of its control? And how can we, and it's a problem of responsibility with respect to ourselves, how can we indeed abstain from this verbosity? And these magic spells, the statements, the beautiful phrases, the empty phrases, and the number of people who participate in this exchange is very, very high. And unless we make claims to ourselves, unless we demand from ourselves as to how not to multiply this, but how to do something else, how to be responsible, how and to what extent can I do something in the world not to litter the space even more? It's a very, very acute question, and when we see in this world, when there is an ever-increasing gap between knowing and thinking, we have to be very cautious, and that we should not posit that there are some ready-made mental structures which we may acquire, and then with the weapons of this thinking, we can transform the world. No, I think to a larger extent we have to be modest with respect to ourselves, with respect to our capacities. As Lev Shestov, the Russian philosopher, wrote about the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, he said that Hamlet was eaten by reflection, the to be or not to be, and he became man because of tragedy. Tragedy humanized Hamlet. So it appears that we need an existential experience of shock. That is why tragedy was believed to be so important for the people in the ancient Greece. A catharsis that would knock us out from the illusory understanding that the knowledge can make us omniscient. It is always an attempt to find the community. How this atomic fragmentation led to higher provincialism. And indeed, one should think so. Indeed, the question really is how we can. Education is thus has to be differentiated between knowing and thinking.
Without no illusions about this world. And Hannah Arendt, as she wrote that in one of her letters to Heidegger, that was a personal letter, she wrote that education in Germany, France, and Italy geht zugrunde. So it has to do with, as she writes in this country, because she was then based in the United States, sees similar processes underway, with the possible exception of the Chicago University. For a while she worked there. Maybe she had reasons to believe that, but the thing is that at this stage, in the 21st century, after the first 20 years of the 21st century, we should get rid of too many patterns and stereotypes, and instead think, not just think and do something about it, as the problem, and the problem Hannah Arendt also mentions in her works, an idea that if you translate it of the Nicomachean Ethics, in Book 6 of Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle draws our attention to the notion of phronesis. In translation into Russian, again, what is lost in the Russian translation is that a meaning that Aristotle implied here. Phronesis, translated into English as practical wisdom. This is a notion that overcomes this dichotomy of theory and practice. Moreover, it tends to doubt that theories can exist per se to be used in practice, as if, for example, I would ever try to teach something and this subject would be ballet, say. Then they would ask me, do you dance ballet? No, but when there are some who teach ethics, is it that we are always confident that they are most ethical creatures that teach this excellent subject? Is that a precondition? So this gap between somebody who talks about things and whether he or she practices it is very often the case. The idea of phronesis, as Aristotle put it in ancient Greek, is that what is the meaning of my existence in this world? And it's not about learning theories by heart, because in this specific situation, no theory would ever give me a hint. What do I do about this? In point of fact, this is reality as is. I do not recall something to draw some abstract truth from some textbook, give me a hint what needs to be done. No, this is very difficult. And this says a very well-known verses by ancient Greek poet. The gods did not give him wisdom of the agriculture or a practical common sense of the digger and groundman and the agricultural, the peasant. They never blame anybody saying that people are doing things wrong. No, they do it, and they do it right. And as they do it, probably, they can in some way or other are responsible for what they do. If I have some critical remarks about, say, somebody else, I first have to bridle my vigor and try to show and demonstrate that I can do it better. And it's so much harder. There are so many of those who are teaching what to do and how to do it properly and seem to be blaming, putting the blame and being indignant. But in terms of doing, in terms of this phronesis, this doing that is needed, nothing much happens. How can you overcome it? I suppose this is the key problem in education. Thank you for your attention.